I've recently watched all of the Friday the 13th films, and in general, it's a very weak series of films. There is a lot of repetition. They're all very, very similar. The last few have been really different. And then we come to Friday the 13th, the 2009 film. This is directed by Marcus Nispel, written by Damien Shannon and Mark Swift, and we have a cast including Jared Padalecki, Danielle Panabaker, Amanda Righetti. We have Derek Mears as Jason Voorhees. And I had two thoughts. One, is this going to be any different to the other films? Certainly the first film. Two, do I want this to exist? And honestly, the answer to those are no, and I'm not bothered. No, it's not tremendously different to the first film, but it's different enough. It's not just a carbon copy, but at the same time, we have nothing really new here. I don't think it really offers anything that's particularly fresh or unique, or indeed leaning into the 21st century aspect of it. There are some changes, of course, but in general, I don't mind it. It's not a bad film on its own, but I don't think it was necessary. I don't want to go into too much detail. I don't want to spoil too much, but there are differences between this and the first one. But the general concept, people, Camp Crystal Lake, somebody out there killing people. Pretty straightforward concept, reasonably well executed as a narrative. Certainly, I don't mind the story. Had I never seen any other Friday the 13th film, I would have thought it's a pretty typical slasher film. It works well, the pacing's fine. Don't care for the characters, but they're not particularly annoying. In terms of the horror aspect, it's okay. It's not the scariest film in the world, but it does a decent enough job of being a horror film. We have a really good use of music and sound. We have some good performances. On its own, absolutely fine. It just doesn't seem necessary. And I feel like, in a way, it's quite insulting, not just from this film, but there are a lot of horror films where they decide, maybe 20, 30 years after the original, to remake them for a more contemporary audience. I guess to get newer generations interested in those films. But it's kind of insulting because it kind of implies that younger generations can't enjoy older films, which is absolutely ridiculous. Now, if it has something different to offer, obviously this is a little different in terms of the narrative, but I don't think it's scarier. It's not taking a completely different approach. Certainly if we compare it to the first couple of Friday, in fact, probably the first good handful of Friday the 13th films, doesn't really offer anything too different. So it doesn't really have anything to say that hasn't been said already. In my opinion, depending on a person's reading of the film, that could be different. But I don't see there's much of an effort in remaking a film unless it feels completely different. Otherwise, let's just market the classics to the newer generations. I think is really insulting to imply that people aren't going to be interested in older films. I feel particularly with horror, maybe not so much with other genres, but horror fans in general. I'm speaking for myself, but also some other horror fans that I know. That's a weird way of saying it. Other horror fans that I'm friends with. I feel like there's actually this great love of older horror films because they just feel so different. They feel rustic and charming, and horror fans, in my opinion, are more likely to appreciate older films than is the case with most genres. I could be wrong about that, but the point there is that more than any other genre, I feel like there's not a need to remake the same films and to tell pretty much the same stories, unless you're offering something different or it's a fresh interpretation, because horror fans, generally speaking, have more of an appreciation for older films than I've seen with fans of other genre. There are going to be exceptions, of course. So I don't think it serves a purpose. I don't think it needed to exist. I don't mind having watched it, but I didn't come away from it feeling like I'd had a fresh perspective on something or that the experience was completely different. Obviously, with very, very, very old horror films, I'm talking early Hammer horror and maybe even before that, they're not necessarily that scary for today's audiences. So remaking those, I think, is fine. But films from the 70s, 80s, I don't think they need to be remade unless you're offering something different. And this, for the most part, doesn't. Nothing spectacular anyway. So on its own, it's a good story. It works well. The slasher aspect is effective. It is a good horror film. We have some decent performances. Don't care for the characters, but they're not annoying. The music is good. The lighting's okay. As a film on its own, it's fine. However, I would never suggest that this is somebody's introduction to Friday the 13th. If you're a horror fan, please watch the first film first. And if you're an existing Friday the 13th film, I don't think this has much to offer. So who is it really aimed at? Because I don't recommend it for people new to Friday the 13th, and I don't really recommend it to Friday the 13th fans. At least, I recommend watching it to form your own opinion, but if you choose not to watch it, you won't be missing out on much, because at least for me, it doesn't feel like part of the Jason Voorhees canon. So I feel like the audience, for me at least, is not very clear, basically not very there. I don't think there is a strong audience for this. On its own, it's fine as part of the Friday the 13th franchise. It doesn't really serve a purpose. That being said, if they ever do get round to doing a Friday the 13th 2 as part of the reboot, although to be fair, I'd imagine they would just reboot it again. I feel like if they were to make a strong effort to try and relaunch the films, I feel like they would just start at the beginning again, which I don't recommend. But at the same time, it's been 16 years since 2009, which is crazy. All things considered, Friday the 13th, 2009 is not a bad film on its own, but it just didn't really feel very necessary.